What does it take to change the course of history? Usually, it's a battle, maybe a treaty. For King Edward IV, it was a secret. In an age of bitter war and backroom politics, he did the unthinkable. He married for love. And not just anyone, okay? He married a common era widow from the wrong side of a civil war. This one act of passion would plunge his kingdom into chaos, make a queen out of an outcast, and set off a chain of events that would destroy one dynasty and forge a new one. This is the story of the royal wedding that broke every rule and rewrote England's future. To really get why this was such a scandal, you have to understand the world it blew up in. Mid-15th century England was tearing itself apart. This was the era of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that wasn't about flowers, but about a dynastic death match for the crown. At its core, the whole thing was a massive family feud, just on a national scale. On one side, you had the House of Lancaster, the ruling family, symbolized by the red rose. Their king, Henry VI, was devout, but mentally fragile, prone to sudden, debilitating mental breakdowns. On the other side stood the House of York, symbolized by the white rose, who had a strong claim to the throne through an older line of descent. They argued their blood was truer, their right to rule more legitimate. For years, England was a chessboard of bloody battles and betrayals. The crown was passed back and forth like a hot potato. Into this chaos stepped a young, charismatic Yorkist, Edward, Earl of March, after his father, Richard, Duke of York, was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460. 18-year-old Edward inherited the Yorkist claim. He was everything Henry VI was not: tall, handsome, a brilliant military commander, and ruthlessly ambitious. In 1461, after crushing Lancastrian armies at Mortimer's Cross and Towton, Edward deposed King Henry and was crowned King Edward IV. He'd won the throne by force, holding onto it in such a divided kingdom that would take shrewd politics, key alliances, and above all, a proper marriage to a foreign princess to secure his new dynasty. At least, that was the plan. But Edward was a king who followed his heart, a trait that was about to cause a political earthquake. King Edward IV was the sun in splendor, the golden boy of the House of York. At over 6 feet tall, he was a giant for his time, famous for his looks and charm. He was a warrior king, sure, but he was also a notorious womanizer. His court was a viper's nest of ambition, and no one played the game better than his chief advisor and cousin, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. History knows him as the Kingmaker. Warwick was the most powerful nobleman in England, a master strategist who had been the driving force behind putting Edward on the throne. For Warwick, the next move was a no-brainer, a strategic marriage for Edward to a European princess, specifically Bona of Savoy, sister-in-law to the French king. This alliance would cement Edward's legitimacy, secure England's borders, and boost its standing in Europe. Warwick was already deep in negotiations, totally confident he was steering the ship of state. But while the Kingmaker was busy with diplomacy, the king's eye had wandered. It was captured by a woman who was, in every conceivable way, the worst possible choice for a Queen of England. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth was a commoner, or pretty close to it. Her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, was high-born, but her father, Sir Richard Woodville, was a mere knight from a middle-ranking family. To make matters worse, Elizabeth was a widow, 5 years older than the king, with 2 sons, and the real kicker in the eyes of the Yorkist court, her first husband, Sir John Grey, had been a Lancastrian who died fighting against Edward's army. She had no dowry, no foreign connections, and 0 political value. Legend has it they met under an oak tree in Whittleberry Forest, where the beautiful and determined Elizabeth came to beg the king to restore her late husband's lands for her sons. Edward was so captivated he tried to make her his mistress, of course, but Elizabeth famously refused, declaring she was too good to be a king's concubine, but not good enough to be his queen. It was a bold rejection that, far from putting Edward off, only made him want her more. Kings in the 15th century didn't marry for love. They married for power. A royal wedding was the ultimate diplomatic tool, meant to forge alliances and produce heirs. Marrying a foreign princess wasn't just expected, it was required. But marrying one of your own subjects, a commoner, a widow from an enemy family, and doing it in secret, that wasn't just unconventional, it was political suicide. And yet, that's exactly what Edward IV did. On May 1st, 1464, a date tied to lovers and folklore, Ward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. The ceremony wasn't in some grand cathedral, but in the private chapel of her family home. There were no cheering crowds, no foreign dignitaries, no powerful lords. The only witnesses were Elizabeth's mother, 2 ladies-in-waiting, and a priest. It was a quiet, personal act of passion that completely ignored every rule of medieval kingship. Edward was known for his appetites, but his decision to marry Elizabeth seems to be about more than just lust. Her refusal to become his mistress may have convinced him that the only way to have her was to make her his wife. For a king who had won his crown through his own sheer will, maybe taking a wife of his own choosing was the ultimate power move, a sign that he was his own man, not a puppet of his council or even the mighty kingmaker. For months, the marriage stayed a closely guarded secret. Edward continued his private visits to Elizabeth, while at court it was business as usual. The Earl of Warwick, totally in the dark, carried on with his negotiations for the French match, bragging about the grand alliance he was about to deliver. The stage was set for a bombshell that wouldn't just embarrass Warwick, but would shake the very foundations of Edward's reign. In September 1464, at a tense council meeting at Reading Abbey, King Edward IV finally dropped the bomb. With the lords pressing him to finalize the French marriage Warwick had arranged, Edward just calmly announced that, "Sorry, lads," he was already married. You could have heard a pin drop. And when he revealed who he'd married the Lancastrian widow, Elizabeth Woodville, that stunned silence turned into pure fury. No one was more enraged than the Earl of Warwick. He had just returned from France, his reputation on the line, thinking he'd secured a diplomatic masterpiece. Instead, the king had publicly and completely humiliated him. The secret marriage was a slap in the face, making it crystal clear that Warwick's influence wasn't as absolute as he and everyone else thought. He saw it as a foolish betrayal that had thrown away a vital alliance for a woman who brought nothing to the table. The rest of the nobility was just as outraged. They saw Elizabeth as a low-born upstart who must have bewitched the king. Her family, the Woodvilles, were seen as grasping and ambitious. The marriage defied all political logic and threatened the stability of the still fragile Yorkist regime. To the court, this wasn't just impulsive, it was a political dumpster fire of Edward's own making that risked everything he'd fought for. It opened a rift between the king and his most powerful ally that would never heal. From that day on, the bond between the king and the kingmaker was broken, and Warwick, a man of immense pride, began nursing a grudge that would curdle into treason. If the secret marriage was the earthquake, the aftermath was a series of powerful aftershocks. With Elizabeth's crowned queen on May 26, 1465, her huge and ambitious family, the Woodvilles, descended on the court like a flock of hungry gulls, and Edward showered them with titles, lands, and, most importantly, powerful marriages. This was the start of the Woodville takeover, and it created a bonfire of resentment among the old guard. Elizabeth had a staggering number of siblings, and they were all quickly married off to some of the richest and most eligible nobles in England. Her sister Catherine married the Queen's own ward, the young Duke of Buckingham. Another sister, Margaret, married the heir to the Earl of Arundel. But the most scandalous match of all was her 20-year-old brother, John Woodville. In a move that horrified the court, he was married to the incredibly wealthy Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a woman in her late 60s, nearly 50 years his senior. To the established aristocracy, who fought tooth and nail for these advantageous matches for their own kids, it was an outrageous power grab. The Woodvilles were seen as greedy opportunists, snatching up every title and heiress in sight. The king's favor seemed endless, and the Woodvilles' rise came at the direct expense of men like Warwick, whose own family plans were being pushed aside. His influence was now being eclipsed by the Queen's father, who was made Earl Rivers and appointed to a high-ranking government position. The court split into factions, the Queen's family on one side and the old, resentful nobility on the other, increasingly gathered around the furious Earl of Warwick. Whispers of witchcraft even started to fly, with accusers suggesting Elizabeth and her mother must have used dark arts to ensnare the king. The political atmosphere grew thick with paranoia, setting the stage for open rebellion. So who do you side with? Was Edward right to follow his heart? Or was Warwick's fury justified? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this royal scandal, make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. The kingmaker wasn't a man who took humiliation lying down. As the Woodvilles rose, Warwick's rage festered. He found an ambitious ally in the king's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who was jealous of the Woodvilles and hungry for power. In 1469, defying Edward's direct orders, Warwick married his eldest daughter, Isabel, to Clarence, sealing a treacherous alliance. Shortly after, they made their move. Warwick ignited a rebellion in the north, and at the Battle of Edgecote, his forces defeated a royal army. In the chaos that followed, Warwick's men captured and executed Queen Elizabeth's father and her brother John. Worse, they captured the king himself. For a brief moment, the kingmaker had the king in his custody. But Warwick quickly learned that ruling without a king was impossible. The country slid into chaos, and he had to release Edward. The peace was a total sham. A year later, in 1470, Warwick and Clarence launched another failed rebellion and fled to France. And there, in a move of absolutely breathtaking cynicism, the great Yorkist kingmaker teamed up with his mortal enemy, the deposed Lancastrian queen, Margaret of Anjou. To seal the deal, Warwick married his other daughter, Anne, to Margaret's son, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. With French support, Warwick invaded England, catching Edward completely by surprise and forcing him to flee to Burgundy. King Henry VI was hauled out of the Tower of London and put back on the throne. Queen Elizabeth, now the wife of a fugitive, took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, where she gave birth to a son and heir. The future Edward V, it looked like the kingmaker had finally won. But Edward IV wasn't going to give up his crown that easily. In March 1471, he landed back in England with a small army, marched across the country gathering support, and in 2 decisive battles, he crushed his enemies. Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet, and the Lancastrian heir was killed at Tewkesbury. Edward was king once more. Edward IV's dramatic return in 1471 kicked off a second reign of relative peace. He had defeated his enemies, and his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the cause of so much chaos, was now secure. They would go on to have 10 children, including 2 sons, Edward and Richard, which seemed to secure the Yorkist line for good. For a decade, it felt like the storm had passed. But the fallout from their secret wedding was far from over. It was just lying dormant. In April 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly at just 40 years old, his health likely wrecked by years of indulgence. His death immediately plunged the kingdom back into crisis. His eldest son was proclaimed King Edward V, but he was only 12. The late king's will named his trusted brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector to rule until the boy came of age. And this is where the devastating legacy of the secret marriage came home to roost. The Woodville family, led by Queen Elizabeth and Richard of Gloucester's faction, immediately started fighting for control of the young king. Richard, claiming the Woodvilles were trying to sideline him, moved fast. He arrested Elizabeth's brother and one of her sons from her first marriage, and took custody of Edward V, placing him in the Tower of London, supposedly to await his coronation. Then, Richard played his trump card, using the controversial beginning of Edward's marriage as his ultimate weapon. He claimed that Edward IV had a pre-existing, legally binding marriage contract with another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. Before he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. If true, that meant his marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, and all of their children, including the young king and his brother, were illegitimate. An act of Parliament, the titulus regis officially declared the children illegitimate, paving the way for Richard to take the throne himself as King Richard III. The two boys, now known as the princes in the Tower, were never seen again, and are presumed to incur crease cast recede to end with sick a crease in with the crease of sick consens can kakurukuren to sick ken to sick kak kitty sick to at where they guided goody you. The secret wedding had provided the very excuse needed to disinherit Edward's sons and destroy his direct line. Richard III's usurpation, however, threw the kingdom into yet another civil war. Elizabeth Woodville, now an enemy of the state, made one final history-altering move. She allied herself with the last major Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor, promising him her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, in marriage if he could defeat Richard. In 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor defeated and killed Richard III. He was crowned King Henry VII, and, true to his word, he married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. This marriage was the final act in the drama that began with a secret wedding decades earlier. The union of Henry Tudor, the heir of Lancaster, and Elizabeth of York, the heir of York, finally brought the Wars of the Roses to an end. It merged the red rose and the white into the new Tudor rose, establishing the Tudor dynasty that would rule England for over a century. The impulsive marriage of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, born of passion, had directly led to this moment. It enraged the nobility, sparked a rebellion that temporarily cost Edward his throne, and gave his own brother the justification to seize the crown and eliminate his sons. Out of that chaos, a new dynasty was born. Elizabeth Woodville, the commoner queen, lived to see her own daughter crowned Queen of England, her bloodline continuing through some of the most famous monarchs in English history, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. So was it a love story or a political disaster? The answer is ... both. It was a secret that plunged a kingdom into turmoil and ultimately destroyed the very dynasty it was meant to secure. And yet, through all the scandal and bloodshed, Edward never abandoned his wife. He risked everything for her, and in doing so, he truly and irrevocably changed the course of English history.